So today we need to talk about drama. And to start out, we're going to talk about the progression of plays over time, which is how we made it up to the modern theater we have today. So, we have to go back to ancient Greece and consider ancient Greek theater. This is the foundation of what we have, at least here in the West, as far as how we produce plays. There's basically a permanent impact. And we actually have several texts of ancient Greek plays that have survived and are often assigned in textbooks for college students and graduate students who go into English. These plays are often even performed still. So, in ancient Greek theater, there were a couple of basic things they had, or didn't have in one case. They were performed, all of them, in outdoor amphitheaters that are basically the ancient equivalent of a sports arena. The Greeks were actually very smart about this, so they understood acoustics. They would build it into like a dip or a hill so that sometimes the audience would be 360 degrees around a central stage, which would be disc-shaped. So they would find a good place for the acoustics so that people could hear. And some of these amphitheaters have actually survived, and if you go on a trip to Greece and go on a tour of them, the tour guide will actually stand out on the stage and have you sit way up on the stone benches that are still in the hill, or what's left of them anyway, and talk to you, and you'll be able to hear her when she speaks. They were written for festivals. Most of the plays were written for festivals. There were several major festivals that would include competitions for playwrights. There was a major one in the fall and a major one in the spring, both for the Greek god, and his name is pronounced a couple of different ways, honestly. Dionysus. That's one way to pronounce it. Trying to pronounce it like someone who's actually from Greece is very difficult for an English speaker. But he was very much seen as the god of plays, and there were several competitions associated with his holidays as a result. They were narrated by a chorus, many of them, not literally all of them, but many of them. So obviously, we imported the word chorus from Greek, and we still use it today. But when we speak of it today, we really just mean a group of singers. This is not the case in ancient Greek times. The chorus would do any number of things. They would talk, they would sing, they would even dance. One of their main jobs was to narrate or to comment on what was happening in the play to make sure that everyone in the audience was understanding the action. Because these plays were pretty elevated, very philosophical, most of them. So in order to make sure everyone can keep up, between each act, the chorus would perform and basically summarize everything that just happened and why it was important, and then the next act would start. I'm sure sometimes when you're reading Shakespeare, you wish someone would do that between each act of a Shakespeare play, and your net result of wishing for that is probably to go to Spartanos and to read Spartanos. So that was their job. They used masks. Even on some modern theater buildings today, we have the smiley mask and then the frowny mask that came from Greek times. But they actually had many, many masks, and most of them were to portray specific characters. So there would be a mask for a young girl, a mask for like a 30-year-old woman, a mask for an elderly man, like whoever they needed to portray, because there were no women actors. All the actors were male. So if they needed to portray any woman at all, or if they needed to portray a young boy or an elderly man, they would need a mask in order to play that character, because they were not otherwise, you weren't going to know otherwise what you were supposed to be looking at. So that was one major function of the mask. Another was that they had these huge exaggerated mouthpieces, which is why the ones that are on the outside of theater buildings now, got really big smile and a really big frown. They did that on purpose because it has this effect. It amplifies what you're saying like a bullhorn. That again was to help the people up on the very top bench actually still be able to hear what the actors were saying. It's actually very smart. Alright. So the ancient Romans didn't particularly do that much different than the ancient Greeks, frankly. The only thing I can really say about Roman theater is that they went through an ultra-violent phase in which if someone were called for to die in the course of the play, they would sometimes bring a POW or slave or somebody like that out and have them play the part and then kill them on the stage for real. Very much in the same line of the gladiatorial combat thing. It's actually very disturbing. Then, when the Roman Catholic Church became the primary dominant power of continental Europe, we went through a time period in which plays were banned. They believed that plays would corrupt you morally, so you were not allowed to perform them. This went on for a long time. Different countries broke away and began creating plays again at different speeds. So how long this lasted varied. In England, we didn't really see, because we're trying to get to Shakespeare here, this is why I specifically went to England. In England, we didn't particularly see much of a breakaway until the 12th to 13th centuries. When we reached that point, people were allowed to perform little miniature plays that were literally Bible stories. So you had to specifically perform a Bible study in order for it to be legal. They called them mystery plays. Obviously, there were no theaters. These were just traveling troops of actors who would go from town to town, didn't have any props or anything fancy like that. They would just gather somewhere, probably at the center of town, and perform, and then people would clap, that kind of thing. So that went on for 200 years. In the 14th to 15th century, they got a little bit more creative about it, and they started writing plays that were Christian allegories. So again, you had to have very blatant Christian morals to your plays, otherwise you would get in trouble with the law. So they're unsurprisingly called morality plays. Then finally, in the early 16th century, in other words, the early 1500s, finally we got some secular plays back. I say we because my ancestors actually did come from the British Isles. So that was a specific referral to my ancestors. So these secular plays were actually nothing more than the Greek and Roman plays from ancient times. So they literally just started performing these ancient plays that survived. Then, about mid-1500s, people started writing new secular plays. So by the end, the late 16th century, that's when we enter the Elizabethan age, and we get Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. We're going to read one act of Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus, which is the famous story of a man who sells his soul to Satan. And obviously we're going to read Hamlet. So, late 1500s, that's when Shakespeare and Marlowe both start writing their plays and performing them. You start getting theaters popping up at long last, but they still have very few props. It's just not fancy. When Shakespeare and his company got together and built the Globe Theatre, theater was still considered so morally questionable that they had to build a theater outside of London city limits. So at the time, it was actually, you had to travel out of London to get to it. The fanciest thing they had was the trapdoor. They actually did have a trapdoor. And the purpose of the trapdoor was to pop supernatural characters up onto the stage and then off the stage again to make it actually seem spooky. So every time a ghost shows up in a Shakespearean play, they popped the ghost up on stage with the trapdoor and then took him back down again. So that part's actually kind of interesting. At this point they had a few props, but they're still not doing much with props. The other thing, other than limited props, to keep in mind, still no women actors. Was not allowed. In fact, when, I can't remember the exact time, I think it was literally the 1800s though, when women finally really began to act in theater, it was still, again, so morally questionable that people would assume that the woman was not simply an actor, but also a prostitute. So there was this, they received a great deal of just nastiness from other people because they dared to be an actor. It was very, very disturbing, actually. So, all those roles that women and girls played in Shakespearean plays, all played by men and young boys. So if you think about the Romeo and Juliet scene, there's a reason why, if you think to this day, you think about how they put that scene on, the Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, Romeo? She's inevitably up on a balcony. Yeah, that's because if she's not up on a balcony, the natural thing for lovers to do would be to run into each other's arms and kiss. But that's a teenage boy and an adult male actor, so the audience would flip out if they actually ran into each other's arms and kissed each other. So, they had to kind of circumvent that by making sure that they weren't too close to each other on the stage. The other thing with Shakespeare that's actually very funny is that in Shakespeare's comedies, he used the fact that the audience knew they were all men to create part of the humor. So he would write stories in which a woman was pretending to be a man for the course of the play. Like, it's a sister who's trying to find her brother, but the only way she can travel safely and alone is to dress up like a man and pretend to be a man. So the audience watching it knows it's a man pretending to be a woman who is pretending to be a man, and they think this is hilarious. I have more notes about Shakespearean theater and the Elizabethan age of theater in the notes that I have loaded into Moodle, so please go read over them and see what else I have to say, because I'm trying to not make this video too long. There's a couple of key drama terms I want to introduce you to that you will need to know, specifically for Marlowe and Shakespeare, because both of them are using these devices. The monologue versus the famous soliloquy. I'm not even gonna lie, I have to stare at this word while I write it. Otherwise, I'm likely to misspell it. Spelling, not my strong skill. Alright, so a monologue and a soliloquy are in fact different. The monologue is a speech that's given by a character to other characters who are on stage. So King Henry, in one of Shakespeare's plays, King Henry gives a speech to his troops. He's trying to rally them. He's giving them a pep talk before they go into battle. That is a monologue. A soliloquy is when the character is alone on stage. No other characters are present. And then the character gives this big long speech. The point of which is inevitably to let you in on their thoughts, because you don't have any other way of knowing otherwise. So Hamlet gives quite a few soliloquies in the course of the play Hamlet. The aside. This is when a character, it's called breaking the fourth wall, breaks the fourth wall by turning and speaking to the audience. And the purpose of it is to usually provide some extra commentary or humor, but the other characters on stage don't hear whatever that character has to say. So in the play Dr. Faustus, the part I'm going to have you read, the character of Mephistopheles at one point breaks the fourth wall and he turns to the audience and goes, "What I wouldn't do to get this guy's soul." So Faustus is standing right there on stage, but he doesn't hear what's happening because it's an aside. This is something that you basically never see in a movie. We don't really have soliloquies the same way now, but we do make use of monologues, no problem, in movies now. The aside I have actually only seen in one movie, but I did see it, where the characters, two of them, turned and looked at the camera after saying something in order to make a point. I think it was a Ryan Reynolds movie, honestly. It's back from in the 90s. But again, it was a comedy, and the point of the aside was comedic effect. It's just quite rare. Okay, so we'll stop there. This video is long enough, but there are more notes for you to look at. I uploaded these to Moodle, so please go check them out, especially before you take the drama quiz. Okay?